You know that feeling when you're going for a run and you're just gasping for air, almost wishing you had like an inhaler or something? A lot of times this will happen in the first 5 to 10 minutes of your workout. Now this could be more than you just being out of shape. Usually what happens is when you start taking those big gulps of air, it's never really fixing the problem and you're still feeling out of breath. But actually what you're doing is you're making the problem worse. Now I'll explain why. So why do we feel breathless in the first place when we're working out? Well, whenever we work out, we start producing more CO2 and our body starts demanding more oxygen. Naturally, we want to get rid of the CO2 because as it builds up, our body thinks it's a waste product. So we start increasing our breathing because every time we exhale or breathe out, then we're getting rid of the CO2, but also when we breathe in, we're getting new oxygen. But this doesn't solve the problem. So I made a little drawing here to help explain. So this is a guy with a pagadi or a turban, and you can see that when he breathes in, he takes in this oxygen, and when he breathes out, he takes out this CO2. Now, when this oxygen comes from the air, it goes into our lungs. And once it's in our lungs, it attaches to a molecule in our red blood cells called hemoglobin. This hemoglobin is basically like a transporter or a train, and it can take 4 of these oxygen molecules and start transporting it to all of our muscles and all of our cells that are in desperate need of this oxygen. Now, our CO2 is important because it helps maintain our blood pH, or the acidity level of our blood. Our blood pH doesn't have that much leeway. It has to be between 7.35 and 7.45. If it gets too low or too high, then we can die. So this is really important, and our body will do anything possible to help maintain this pH level. Now, what you gotta understand is if our pH level is off, specifically if our pH level is not 7.35 by the time this hemoglobin reaches our cells, then this oxygen will not detach from this hemoglobin. So let's say that this hemoglobin carrying this oxygen wants to go to my bicep muscle because I'm working out my bicep. But if my pH in my blood is not 7.35, if it's instead 7.45, then this oxygen will never go to my bicep. It will stay attached to this hemoglobin. And then my bicep will still be starving for more oxygen. And then my body will start feeling oxygen deprived and try to take another deep breath to get more oxygen. This is the problem, and this is why you're feeling so breathless when you go for your run or your jog, because you can get all the oxygen that you want. If you take a pulse oximeter on your finger and measure your oxygen saturation, which measures how much oxygen is attached to this hemoglobin, that can be at 100%. But if you don't have enough of the CO2, that means your blood pH is not going to be regulated. And if your blood pH is off, then this oxygen is never going to the places it needs to go. Even though it's getting to your lungs, it doesn't mean it's actually getting to the cells that it needs to go in. And it's not getting to your muscles. This is also something called the Bohr effect, where if you don't have enough of the CO2, then your oxygen will not be able to detach from this hemoglobin and go to your cells. So how do you fix this? Well, the first thing is going to be properly warming up before your exercise. The first thing you got to do is a walking warm-up with breath holds. So the way I would do this is I would first walk for a minute just to get a normal pace and kind of evaluate my breathing. And then after that minute, I will start doing a breath hold after an exhale. So I'll breathe out, preferably through my nose, and then hold my breath. And then I'll hold my breath until I get this medium to strong urge to breathe. You don't want to be dying to take the next breath. Once I get that medium urge to breathe, then I'll recover by breathing through my nose like normal for a minute. And then I'll repeat that 10 times. The reason that these breath holds are so important is because it's preparing your body to tolerate more carbon dioxide. Because like I said, once you start exercising, your body starts producing more CO2. When your body starts producing more CO2, it naturally wants to breathe faster and faster. And then in turn, it will get rid of the CO2 and start trying to take in more oxygen. This is also why most asthma attacks happen in the first 10 minutes of any workout, because you're not prepared for that increase in CO2. So if you start warming up properly, then your body's going to be anticipating or already used to this higher amounts of CO2 and you won't feel as breathless. Now you can also take this one step further and start doing actual breath hold training by doing breath holds during your actual workout. This is also called high altitude training. So basically the way to do this is the same thing you did for your warm-up, do during your actual warm-up. So warm up first, and then when you're going for your jog, do the same thing. After an exhale, hold your breath until you get that medium to strong urge to breathe. So let's say it takes you 10 steps before you get that medium urge to breathe, then recover your breathing. A good gauge to see if you held your breath long enough and not too long is when you're recovering, if you can recover with just 1 to 2 breaths before you go back to normal breathing. If you are dying after your breath hold and you're basically gasping for air, then you've held your breath too long and you should probably abandon the exercise and then try again. You don't want to overdo this because if you have to abandon the exercise and then start all over, then you're not going to really be getting the benefits. Instead, it's better to gradually keep working on it. You'll notice that as the weeks go on, if you keep this up, then your ability to hold your breath will get better and better. And in turn, that breathless feeling will not be there as much because your breathing has become more and more efficient. This will also increase your VO2 max. Your VO2 max is a measure of your fitness level because it's basically measuring how efficiently your body can utilize oxygen when you're exercising. So if you're able to utilize this oxygen more efficiently, then you're going to be naturally increasing your VO2 max. And this is also why people go to these higher altitudes like Colorado or these different mountains to go train for a big event because they're forcing their body to be in lower conditions of oxygen and forcing themselves to tolerate higher amounts of CO2. Now the thing is, you don't have to go to these mountains to do that high altitude training. You can literally bring it to your house by doing these breath exercises. Now your CO2 tolerance is one thing, but you also get other benefits with this high altitude training. When you're deprived of this oxygen, then your body will naturally try to put more of these oxygen carriers into your body because it's trying to utilize whatever oxygen is there. So your spleen will start releasing more of these red blood cells that have this hemoglobin in them to go and carry more oxygen in your body. And also your kidneys will start releasing a molecule called EPO or erythropoietin, which will help mature even more red blood cells. So more red blood cells means more oxygen carriers in your blood, and more oxygen carriers means your oxygen is going to be delivered more efficiently. Now something else you can start doing is just simply breathing less. And you can do that first of all by focusing on only using your nose to breathe. Also when you're exercising too. At first this is going to be hard. You might have to scale back your workout and slow down your jog a little bit, but after a couple of weeks you're actually going to see an improvement in your performance. Now this might feel weird to do, to start only using your nose when you're working out or exercising. Just know that your nose is meant to be used for breathing. And if you're not used to using your nose, you might have a lot of drainage because when your nose has been dormant for a while, then your sinuses and your mucus buildup gets built up a lot, and you'll probably see a lot of drainage for those first couple weeks. But if you keep blowing your nose and getting all this mucus out and keep up with that nose breathing, then you're going to be able to first breathe a lot better because your sinuses will be really drained, and you'll also be in much better shape. Now the other benefits you get from nose breathing is, one, your nose acts like a filter. It'll filter out between 98 to 99% of viruses and bacteria before that air enters your lungs. It also filters out a lot of different dust and particles. It also tempers the air, makes it to a more gentle temperature that's similar to your body temperature, so it causes less inflammation in your lungs. And it also humidifies the air because your lungs don't like cold, dry air. They like warmer, moister air. And the other benefit you get from nose breathing is nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a molecule that's produced in your paranasal sinuses. So as you inhale through your nose, your air passes through these sinuses and gets this nitric oxide. And this nitric oxide is both a vasodilator and an antibacterial. So first it'll prevent you from getting sick, but also it acts as a vasodilator, meaning it will dilate these blood vessels and improve the gas exchange in your lungs, meaning your oxygen is going to be transported even more efficiently. Now, another thing you're going to notice with these breath exercises is you're going to have less lactic acid buildup. Athletes who do this high altitude training have fewer recovery times, and they are also less sore after their workout. And that's because they have more of this oxygen delivery to their cells, and in turn they get less of this lactic acid buildup. And also by improving their CO2 tolerance, they're able to tolerate a more acidic environment in the first place. Now I want to show you a little study more on the importance of carbon dioxide. So this study took 20 healthy adults and they put them into 3 different groups. All of the groups had induced hypoxia, meaning they were put into an environment where there was not that much oxygen. So one group was a control group where it was just normal air with less oxygen. And the other 2 groups had this hypoxic air mixed in with additional CO2. So the second group had 3% CO2 mixed in, and the third group had 5% carbon dioxide in their air. And they recorded data both before they started, 1 minute after the gas exposure and 5 minutes after the gas exposure. Before the exposure, there was no differences in their oxygen saturation. But then after the exposure, the control group had the lowest amount of oxygen saturation. What they found is during the exposure, the control group, the group that had no CO2 mixed in, their levels of oxygen quickly dropped. But the groups that had CO2, it kind of acted like a buffer. So you'll see in the graph that the 3% group, their oxygen levels dropped only slightly. And in the 5% group, their oxygen levels barely dropped at all. And also the recovery in the groups with CO2 was much better and faster. And you can see that the 5% group stayed the highest the whole time and also recovered the best and fastest. You can see that it took a whole 5 minutes for the control group to get back to their baseline levels of oxygen. And it only took about 2 minutes for the CO2 groups to get back. And actually the groups that had CO2 actually went past their baseline. So their oxygen levels were even better than when they started. So I'm hoping by looking at this, you can see that CO2 is not considered a waste product. It is just as important as oxygen. The problem is a lot of people right now are in a state of having not enough CO2. In other words, they are hypocapnic or in a state of hypocapnia. You get hypocapnia when you start breathing too much or too excessively. The problems with hypocapnia is everything gets very constricted. So CO2 is a dilator. When you have more CO2, everything gets dilated. But when you don't have enough CO2, then your breathing tubes will get shrunken and your blood vessels will also shrink. So that means that those blood vessels that carry that oxygen, it'll be harder. It'll be harder to transport your oxygen throughout your body. And also your breathing tubes will shrink, meaning it's harder to breathe in the first place. This is something from one of my courses that I took that I think is really interesting. So it was looking at the breathing rates over the last 100 years. And you'll see that over the last 100 years, our breathing rates, or the volume of air that we have been breathing, have skyrocketed. In the 1920s, our breathing rates were about 5 to 6 liters of air per minute. Now, this is ideal. This is how much we really should be breathing. But then something happened in the 1950s, and our breathing rates started going up. What also happened during the 1950s is fast food hit the market. We had McDonald's and KFC and a lot of these other processed, unhealthy foods that hit the market. And now if you look at it, our breathing rates are up at 12 liters of air per minute. So in the last 100 years, the volume of air that we've been breathing has doubled. Now these higher breathing rates and breathing incorrectly are what contributes a lot to these chemical imbalances in our body and our CO2 levels being too low. Now, I did make some other videos as to why our breathing has changed, and in a nutshell, it comes a lot after industrialization. So after industrialization, our foods have become a lot softer and less in nutrients, so we have to chew our food a lot less, and in turn, we don't get as much jaw growth. So our jaws have gotten smaller, and in turn, this affected our breathing. So now, instead of breathing through our nose all the time, people have started breathing through their mouth a lot more. And when you breathe through your mouth all the time, then naturally the volume of air that you take in and out of your lungs is going to be higher. This will also put people into a state of chronic stress, because when you breathe too much, like let's say if you hyperventilate, it's putting you into a sympathetic stress mode where you're going to be possibly chronically stressed all the time. Not all evolution is good, and this is definitely one of those types that has been bad for us. So your goal should be to get that breathing rate down to about 5 to 6 liters of air per minute. Now, I don't want you to focus too much on the number. The main thing should be just focusing on slowing down your breathing and only using your nose to breathe. Now, this may seem difficult to basically shrink your breathing rate in half, but if you keep up with these exercises like the high altitude training and the breath holds, then you can definitely get there, and your breathing volume will definitely come down. And in turn, this will also help with any stress and anxiety, because instead of breathing too much and constantly being in that state of stress or fight or flight, then you're going to be bringing your body into a state of calm. So try these exercises next time you're going to go for a run or any form of cardio, and let me know what you think. What is the best indicator for how physically fit someone is? Well, if you looked at the title, you probably guessed it. It's your VO2 max. Your VO2 max is the maximum amount of oxygen your body can use when you're exercising. So having a higher VO2 max is better, because it means that your body's using oxygen more efficiently.